So a lot of you guys have been asking for Ultimate Spider-Man, and I figured we'd give it a shot. And it's really kind of cool here because Ultimate Spider-Man is really where the Ultimate Universe began. And it really makes sense too, because those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, right now, All New, All Different Marvel is designed to be a combination of the Ultimate Universe and the traditional Marvel Earth 616 universe molded into one, which is just now called Earth Prime. I still call it Earth 616 because everything is the same with the exception of the fact that the Ultimate Universe continuity was kind of rolled in, or at least the characters were rolled in, and some of their history remains the same. It was really more just like concepts that were thrown in there. But at the very least, it keeps things relatively familiar for people who are coming from both sides. But Ultimate Spider-Man is really where the Ultimate Universe originated from. Now, this really started with Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, I think. And the idea was to quite literally just take the entire concept of Marvel Comics and to make it more updated. Now, this really came out of the near collapse of the comic book industry. And I'm not really going to go into that too deep just because we've had a lot of discussions on that. But it was really just rooted in the idea that people were buying comics under the belief that they would be worth a lot of money later on down the line. The issue is that the more of something people buy, the less value that it has. And so because of that, this belief that comics would be worth a ton of money resulted in publishers just releasing more and more comics, which they essentially just flooded the market. So it meant the comics themselves got to the point where they were worth almost nothing, people stopped buying them, and then it led to the near collapse of the industry. But the idea here was that with Marvel recovering, or Marvel trying to recover from this near collapse, on one side you had Joe Quesada running the Marvel publishing line with regards to all their different concepts and all their different teams and so on and so forth. But it was also the idea of trying to update the continuity for the modern reader so that kids who were getting into comic books in the year 2000, who are wanting to get into comic books in 2001, 2002, so on and so forth, could jump in and see their characters updated in contemporary ways. And so it made sense to really just start with Spider-Man because Peter Parker is the face of Marvel Comics. When people think of Marvel, they don't really think of the Incredible Hulk first, they don't really think of Captain America first, they think of Spider-Man. And so because of that, it made sense to grab Peter Parker and roll him in. Now, for those of you guys who have seen the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, or who have seen the, Sony's disastrous attempt, really, to try to reboot the franchise with Amazing Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield, a lot of what we're going to see in the early part of this story in terms of his origins is almost image for image what we saw in the movies. And the reason why is because almost all the cinematic movies that are made based on comic book characters are largely rooted in the Ultimate Universe. They're very rarely ever rooted in the main Marvel universe. One of the reasons why you don't see a lot of similarities there. You'll see more similarities, for example, between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Ultimate Universe than you will between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the main Marvel Universe. The only exception to that is like Captain America's origin story. He was the original super soldier instead of Nick Fury, so on and so forth. But the fact remains here that what this does is it initially picks up at Oscorp. And again, this is just one of the updated things. Instead of just simply saying there was an irradiated spider once upon a time that bit Peter Parker, we're kind of given some motive behind it. And what we learn is that really Norman Osborn is working on a substance called, now, a lot of this ties into the work of Peter Parker's parents, and that'll be an ongoing theme that'll take place later on in the publication history. But again, all of this really comes out of the super soldier serum. For those of you guys who saw my video, or who didn't see my video rather, on Ultimate Origins, we had talked about how the first successful super soldier in the Ultimate Universe was Nick Fury. After him came Captain America, came Wolverine. With Wolverine came the origin of mutants, so on and so forth. Bruce Banner experimented on himself, became the Incredible Hulk, but with the exception of Steve Rogers, there was nobody else who was the super soldier. There was no one else that really been able to duplicate the formula in the same capacity. And because of this, the work of Peter Parker's parents was rooted in the idea of trying to crack the super soldier serum and trying to find a way to make it perfect so that it could be used. The issue with this is that Norman Osborn's kind of trying to continue this trend, but also use it for his own purposes. And of course, what he says is that they've basically been using this for using animal testing, one of which is a spider. Now from here, we kind of jump to Peter Parker's personal life, and this really isn't done for anything spectacular. This is really just to kind of give us an idea of where Peter Parker's coming from. That he's a kid who's picked on, he's a kid who's made fun of. It's really just Brian Michael Bendis and Bagley refreshing us with his character. Like, hey guys, this is the Peter Parker that you know. He's basically the nerd, he's the outcast, not really a pariah, but he's certainly the kid who's like the geek, the quintessential geek. He doesn't quite get the respect of the girl. Mary Jane Watson is a friend, but as far as we could tell, they're friends and they're never going to be anything besides that. They're friends, and it's really because she just kind of stuck him in the friend zone. That really seems to be the direction that things are going in. But we also get a little bit of humor here in the sense that they're at a mall right now. And so we basically have Peter Parker, his Uncle Ben show up and kind of try to bring the two together. Hey, Peter, why don't you say something to Mary Jane Watson instead of being awkward? Like, why don't you just say, hey, let's go out sometime or something along those lines? lines, but of course Peter can't quite pull it together. Now, of course, back at school, it's much the same way. I mean, of course, we learn that Harry Osborn is kind of like the rich, cool kid. Flash Thompson is the school jock, you know, he's the star of the basketball team. Peter Parker just doesn't quite fit in when it comes to sports. Again, it's just kind of this roundabout explanation of, hey, here's Peter Parker's life, here's the before shot, now you're about to get the after shot. Now, with regards to this after segment, again, Peter Parker and Harry Osborn are really more friends by circumstance. I wouldn't really consider them to be like the best of friends. It's really one of these issues where Peter Parker basically does his homework for him, and Harry Osborn is like Peter's connection to what it would be like to be cool. What we also get here is a little bit of backstory. We get a little bit of exposition. We don't get a whole lot. We learn that Peter Parker's parents had died, but we also learned that Peter's father had been working on this adhesive substance. And of course, we know just by virtue of foreshadowing, that'll go on to become the substance that Peter uses for his webbing. But at the moment, he's never really been able to crack it. He hasn't been able to figure it out. The other half of this is that for Harry Osborn himself, his relationship with his father is very, very strained. And this is something that I really, really liked about what it is that Bendis wrote, because this is why I say, when it comes to Bendis' writing, Bendis is grade A when it's developing characters. When it comes to story arcs, when it comes to like major crossover events, he's kind of spotty. But if you hand Bendis a character and say, flesh this character out, or if you go to Bendis and say, make a character and flesh them out, Bendis will do one hell of a job doing it, because he's just great when it comes to working on individual characters. The struggle between Harry Osborn and Norman Osborn is really more of a situation of Harry wanting the respect of his father, but also just wanting some measure of attention from his father. The issue here is that Osborn spares no time for his son. It's really just one of these things where he's just too busy. He doesn't really worry about him too much. You know, there's always somebody else to make sure that Harry has what he needs. And so because of this, they're not nearly as close as you would expect. There's not a real animosity or hatred. It's really more just two ships that just kind of sail by each other, and they never really have time to talk or say anything. And so because of this, we jump to Osborn Industries, you know, basically. We jump to the incident when Peter's bitten by a radioactive spider. And again, Bendis takes things fast. I mean, Bendis does not slow down here. I mean, it starts 0 to 60. It immediately takes off. The spider that had been experimented on was supposed to have been kept in containment. The issue is that the spider was able to make its way out. And of course, it bites Peter Parker. This is why I say it happens super fast. Now, the reason why Bendis is doing this too is because Bendis is also paying homage to Amazing Fantasy number 15 the way it was originally done. What I mean here is back in the early 1960s when Marvel was coming onto the scene, I mean, DC was like the publisher. I mean, it was DC Comics. You had a few here and there, but if you were reading comics, you were reading DC, and that's really all there was to it. I mean, science fiction was still popular, but in terms of superheroes, it was DC. I mean, they were the sole star of the game for the most part. And because of this, Marvel literally just had to create origins over the course of like a page or two and send them out and let the story kind of unfold on its own. And that's what happened. You know, when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko sat down and they said Peter Parker Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 15, it was, hey, he's Peter Parker, he's picked on, he's kind of the nerd. They're on a field trip rather. He's bitten by a radioactive spider, he becomes Spider-Man, and we're off to the races. That's basically how it went. Like, it was super fast paced. Bendis does that to the same degree here, in the sense that bitten by a radioactive spider within the first issue, and suddenly it comes on him. The difference here is that we get a little more expansion in terms of how this works. Now, the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker got this same treatment later on down the line. It was done especially in future Amazing Spider-Man stories, and even stories that went back and touched on his origin again. But with the whole Ultimate Universe thing, it was a chance for Bendis and Mark Bagley to sit down and say, okay, if we're going to retell the origin of Peter Parker, we've got one shot at this. And so we need to make sure that we go for broke. We need to give people the best updated modern origin story that we could give for Peter Parker to give him something right off the bat. Because remember, the purpose of the Ultimate Universe was not to be as expansive as the main Marvel Universe. The purpose of the Ultimate Universe was to be easily accessible, tight-knit, very easy to follow. And so because of that, the origin stories of characters and people who were introduced had to follow much the same way. Now, when it came to Peter Parker being bitten, Osborn and his guys found out about it pretty fast. The issue with this was that in their mind, there were only really two options here. The first was to basically cover his medical bills, which would be an admission of guilt. Or the second is to simply just wait and let his family sue them, because again, they're operating from a corporate standpoint. But what Norman Osborn says is they're going to cover the medical bills, assuming that he goes to the hospital. They're going to do it anonymously, and then they're going to sit back and watch. And the reason for this is because Osborn had been intending to move towards the direction of human trials, but the issue is that there was going to be a lot of red tape. He'd have to go through a lot of federal laws and regulations, FDA, so on and so forth, in order to allow this to be tested on people to even begin the process of doing that. But instead, to his luck, some kid stumbled into Osborn Industries, was bitten by a spider, and no one really knows what the effects may be. And so by just kind of sitting back and watching, letting these things unfold, Osborn's hoping to smooth things over a bit with regards to Uncle Ben and Aunt May by more or less throwing money at it and then hoping for the best. And so because of that, Peter's life begins to take this really interesting turn. And that's what I like about this, because it's just super cool, it's super quick, things move relatively fast, in the sense that as he's being picked on by one of the kids named Kong, I want to say that that his name is Kenneth McFarlane, I think, his spider sense kicks in and he immediately counters. Now again, Peter's learning all of this stuff for the very first time. This is all brand new to him, but every time, or at least it seems in the beginning, when he has this experience, he begins to pass out. Now, of course, he wakes up in the hospital. Oh, no, everything's fine. It's okay. Not a great big huge deal. They take a little bit of blood work and that's about it. Now, when the blood work's taken to be tested by the nurses, a guy by the name of Mr. Shaw actually takes it and ends up bringing it back to Norman Osborn. Now, when they get it back to Osborn, the testing that they do basically reveals it seems to be killing him. And this is where things get a little bit murky. Following this revelation that Peter Parker is essentially going to die by virtue of the spider that bit him, he's fed banana bread by Aunt May. Now, we don't know exactly what it is that's going on here. When I was reading through this, I was kind of like, well, maybe I'm reading a little bit more between the lines than I should. It may be that just potassium was the missing ingredient. But by literally serving him an entire loaf of banana bread, Peter's powers continue to progress on normally. And so the idea seems to be here that potassium was the missing link. It was the one thing he needed to keep his powers from killing him. And the reason why is we'll find out later on that he's actually getting better. It's working in his benefit. But the idea here is that Mr. Shaw had essentially been contracted by Norman Osborn to basically kill Peter Parker, because remember, they're operating under the assumption that he's going to die anyway. And so if he's going to die anyway and he's just hit by a rogue car, then things will be fine. Now, something that I want to point out here is that Mr. Shaw is not Sebastian Shaw of the Hellfire Club, at least not that I know of. This is just a random guy named Mr. Shaw. I'm not that familiar with the Ultimate Universe. I don't even know if the Hellfire Club exists in the Ultimate Universe. It might, or it might have been mentioned in some form or fashion. I'm pretty sure Sebastian Shaw exists, but if I'm wrong about that, I'm sure that you guys will correct me down in the comments section. But the fact remains here that when the vehicle, as it's driven by Mr. Shaw, goes to hit Peter Parker, of course his reactions kick in, he's able to jump over it, and when Shaw reports back to Norman Osborn, he's like, don't do anything, we need to keep an eye on him. Now from here, Peter begins using his own ingenuity and begins kind of poking around, doing some experimentation, testing his own blood, and comes to the realization that he basically has spider powers. He has the agility, the strength, the reflexes of a spider. Now it blows his mind that that's a possibility, but the other half of this is that his studies, his whole experience here is changing the very fundamental course of his life. Now the reason why this works out is because Brian Michael Bendis removes the element of like puberty, as we would call it, and replaces it with being bitten by a radioactive spider. And what I mean here is that as teenagers, when we grow, when we become 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, we become rebellious. It's just how we are. We test our limits. We want freedom. We want to be able to get out there. We want to do our own thing. We want to be adults. We're rushing to grow up, not realizing that by the time we become adults, we want to go back to being teenagers again. It's just one of those crazy circles of life that we all experience. But with regards to his relationship with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, it becomes very strenuous here. And the reason why is because Peter Parker's always been a kid that kept his head in the books, valued his education over everything else. But with him studying these powers, he's basically blowing off school. This is being reported to Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and they're like, what's going on with you? Why are you doing this? And Peter Parker is taking very much the rebellious teenage route of, well, don't worry about me. I've got it together. Leave me alone. And so again, the last little bit of his power, at least in this first issue anyway, the last little bit of his power that begins to manifest is, of course, his ability to crawl on walls. Now, at this point, Bendis begins to focus a little bit more on Peter Parker in relation to how he uses his powers, because it plays out exactly the way that we would expect. If we were a teenage kid who was 15, 16 years old, and we suddenly had enhanced strength, speed, agility, and so on, we would use it to become cool. We'd use it to face off against the various bullies that gave us a hard time. And that's exactly what happens. Flash Thompson starts making unwanted passes at Mary Jane Watson. Of course, Peter Parker steps up and says, hey man, get out of here. In response, Flash Thompson basically picks a fight. Peter dodges him at every turn, goes to block one of his punches, and it's like hitting a brick wall. Flash Thompson's hand breaks in the process. Now, this is where Bendis begins to segue away from the idea of Peter Parker's powers being contained only to him, to them having impacts on everybody else around him. The first is that with Kong, hanging out with Harry Osborn, telling him about everything that was going on with Flash Thompson, Norman Osborn hears all this and says, hey man, I'd love it if you were to bring Peter Parker and yourself over to Osborn Industries. I can show you guys everything, show you all that cool stuff. You guys will have a great time. And Harry's like, yeah, sure. Anything to spend time with my dad, so he's like, yeah, he's definitely on board with that. The other half of this is the parents of Flash Thompson threatened to sue Aunt May and Uncle Ben. So because of this, it's also the idea that there's ramifications. Now for them, they're effectively broke. And so the idea of how it is that they're going to pay a $2,500 medical bill really kind of baffles them. And so what this does is it allows Peter the process of basically going through and experimenting with his powers a little bit more, realizing how strong he is and being able to throw around cars. But it also allows the story to segue into the now famous, of course, gym scene. Now, with regards to Osborn Industries, to kind of touch on this for a second, when Peter and Harry get over here, it really is basically just an ambush, but we're also shown a lot of characters who are going to go on to play major roles later on. Of course, Dr. Octopus, Doc Ock, is an employee at Osborn Industries and so on, but Peter Parker Parker is essentially just hit with a needle where blood's taken, and then he basically just bails out, because for him it's a terrifying situation to suddenly have blood drawn. Not only that, Doc Ock begins talking with Norman Osborn and says, hey look, what we thought was happening before is not happening. Peter Parker's not dying. Peter Parker's getting better. Not only that, he's developing abilities. The things that he can do basically put him on par with a spider. He's effectively a spider in human form. He has all the same abilities proportional to a spider. And so Osborn says, well, the only thing that we can do now, since we have a human out there that can be tested, is we have to continue the process. We need to repeat the test. We need to see if it can be done again. And so he says, I'm going to try it on myself. And of course, we know this will lead into the Green Goblin. Now, the way the Green Goblin's depicted here is actually really, really cool. But to hold off on that for a second, picking up with a wrestling match, this is actually not the most important thing ever. This does not play out the same way that it did with regards to the Spider-Man movie, under Sam Raimi, where the guy robbed the wrestling owner, ring guy, whatever it was, and then took off with the money. Instead, that actually happens through a different situation. But the fact remains here that it does allow Peter to explore his powers a little bit more, make a little bit of money for himself, so on and so forth. But it also basically gives him his name in the sense that because, of course, all this is fixed, he'd never really been given a name before. So the idea was that in the middle of all this commotion and carrying on and so forth, the name that's basically given to him is Spider-Man, because when he's asked, what's your name? He's like, well, I don't really know. I mean, I guess, the Spider is what he initially goes with. And the ring commentator says, the Amazing Spider-Man. And so from that point going forward, everybody's like, Spider-Man. Now, he's a huge ring attraction, but it's where the name comes from. It's where the name sticks. The other half of this is when he's paid by the ring announcer, he basically says, hey man, you look like a goof. Like, you look ridiculous. So I've had this costume worked up for you, throw it on. And it's the traditional Spider-Man costume minus the spider insignia and the webbing. And so of course, Peter says, hey, look, I need to go ahead and throw this on. Now from here, we get into the introduction of the Green Goblin, or at the very least, the transformation of the Green Goblin. That's why I say things happen really, really, really fast in this story. Bendis waits for no man. He really just kind of throws things out quick in the sense that Harry Osborn basically witnesses the entire event take place, although he's not really supposed to, but it's really just Norman Osborn being tested, Dr. Octopus, of course, relishing the experience, and then whatever happens next results in a multitude of people being killed, a multitude of people all being attacked. Dr. Octopus is, of course, alive, but most everybody else is dead here. The issue with this is that, with Harry Osborn being alive, he's the one person who is actually going to come forward, at least reveal to Peter Parker and most of his friends anyway, what it is that took place here. But we know this is basically a circumstance where Norman Osborn was transformed into the Green Goblin and immediately started tearing things apart. Now, one of the big differences, this is something that I actually want to point out here, one of the big differences between what Brian Michael Bendis is doing here with the relation between Peter Parker and the Green Goblin is how fast they learn about each other. Now, the reason why I say this is, well, I guess we'll get to that here in a second, but for right now, I want to transition to basically the death of Uncle Ben. With Uncle Ben being killed, this comes by way of a guy who essentially just robbed a deli. Peter Parker doesn't do anything to stop the guy. Now, it's not because of the fact that the deli owner did anything to him. It's not because of the fact that the deli owner somehow, wouldn't give him a deal on the sandwich or anything like that. There was no real grudge there. It was simply that Peter Parker just didn't feel like doing anything. He didn't want to have anything to do with that. Now, something that I had basically backpedaled on here, something that I hadn't really gone too deep into with this particular thing, is the idea of the phrase from Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. And the reason why I say that is because there is a major fight that takes place between Uncle Ben and Peter Parker. When Peter Parker gets home after letting this robber escape, he's confronted with the fact that his grades are basically slumping. And of course, again, Peter Parker begins to lash out and says, you guys don't understand what's going on with me. You guys can't begin to understand what's going on. This is ridiculous. I'm cool now. I have abilities. I'm capable. He doesn't really go into specifics, but it's basically just the angsty teenager lashing out at his parental figures. And so because of this, he takes off and he actually ends up going to hang out with Kong for a while. And then a great big huge party's thrown. Now, at this party, there's a girl named Liz, and Liz seems to be the girl that most people enjoy the company of. And in the middle of all this, Mary Jane Watson walks in. Of course, Mary Jane Watson sees Peter Parker and Liz. It's really more of just kind of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not really what it seems. But in her storming out and taking off, when Peter Parker goes to chase after her, he's confronted by Uncle Ben. Now, this is when Uncle Ben says, hey, look, I understand you have things going on. I understand that there's stuff going on in your life that you can't tell us about. Now, keep in mind, Uncle Ben's not a fool, but Uncle Ben has no earthly clue that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. I mean, he doesn't know that. All he knows is that Peter Parker is just going through what he believes to be normal teenage, angsty, angry at the world, trying to figure himself out kind of stuff. But what he says is, your father had a figure of speech that served him well, and it is this: if you have the power to change something, then you should use the power to change something. If you have the power to make the world a better place, it's your responsibility to make the world a better place. With great power comes great responsibility. Peter Parker, of course, responds to this by saying, if he knew so much, then why is he dead? So again, this is really Peter just failing to hear the words of Uncle Ben. And it's just kind of this updated retelling of the last argument that the two of them have and why Peter will carry so much guilt around. Now, of course, with Peter leaving, lashing out and then eventually coming back home again, when he gets there, Uncle Ben's been killed. Now, with regards to the death of Uncle Ben, what we basically learn is that the man that Peter Parker had allowed to escape had basically just run up inside the house of Peter Parker's family while he was gone, demanded money from Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben cracked a joke saying, "Hey man, you probably got more money than we do," and the guy just shot him for it. And of course, he turned coat and ran away. In response, Peter Parker goes after him. But the entire time that this happens, while Peter Parker's taunting this guy, while Peter Parker's striking terror into the heart of this guy, he's dealing with a lot of inner turmoil here. Despite his anger and how he would like to believe he actually is, Peter Parker is good at heart. Peter Parker is a good human being. At the moment, he's angry, but he also has to reconcile this with the fact that if he were to kill this guy, it would stick with him for the rest of his life. Not only that, the reason why Uncle Ben's dead is very much the fault of Peter Parker. A lot of really hardcore Spider-Man fans would contest that. They would say, well, there's no way for you to know that Uncle Ben would have been killed by this guy. Even if Peter Parker had stopped, he would have been killed by somebody else or something like that. It was fate. Uncle Ben was always going to die. That may be. But what we do know with absolute certainty is that if Peter Parker had stepped up and stopped this guy, that guy wouldn't have killed him. And so because of this, Peter Parker looks at this and says that it's basically his fault. He's the reason why his Uncle Ben had been killed here. And so because of that, while the whole situation is more or less a standoff with Captain Stacy, leading the charge and everything, Peter Parker basically defeats this guy, throws him out a window with a rope attached, doesn't really hang him, just kind of throws him out the window for the police to deal with, and then calls it a day. In response to this is Peter Parker coming to the realization that there was truth in his father's words, that even if the world didn't know that Peter Parker had fantastic abilities, he knew he had fantastic abilities, and it was his job to step up and stop that robber when he first saw him doing something. And so because of this, Peter Parker basically begins the process of becoming Spider-Man as we know him, in the sense that he becomes a superhero. Now, what Bendis does here is he says, hey, we don't need a great big huge grandiose scale of events. We don't need 19 story arcs showing us Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man. Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man is a timeless tale. The death of Uncle Ben will be a timeless story from now until the end of time. In 500 years, when people are talking about Spider-Man, the death of Uncle Ben will be a core part of his story. It may have been retold 200 times between now and then, but it'll always be the same. Uncle Ben is killed by a guy that Spider-Man could have stopped. And so because of that, Bendis is just like, hey, here's a one-page collage of like Spider-Man being a hero, because that's really all we need. And that's the greatest thing about this. That's one of the things that made this so cool, is because here's the nitty-gritty. Here's what you guys need. More so than that, Mary Jane Watson sits down with Peter Parker, and it's this moment between the two of them that had long since been coming. It was really the closeness of the situation that brought them together. One of the reasons why this is so significant, and I don't know how many people would have originally caught this, but one of the reasons why this is so important is because this harkens back to the death of Gwen Stacy. In 1971, when Jerry Conway killed off Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane Watson had always been depicted as this girl who was very self-absorbed, this girl who only really cared about herself. I mean, she was a very successful and beautiful model. Gwen Stacy was always the more down-to-earth, reasonable girl that Peter Parker was always going to be with. When Jerry Conway killed her off and brought in Mary Jane Watson, basically had Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson come together, there was the infamous scene when the two of them were talking and she had asked something about Gwen Stacy and he said, why do you care? The only person you care about is yourself. And where she was inclined to leave, she closed the door and stayed. And that was the two of them solidifying that Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker will get together. The opposite to a degree happens here, in the sense that it's actually the death of Uncle Ben that triggers more or less Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker growing closer together, which was a beautiful way to play this particular scene out. But from here, Peter Parker again continues to experiment a little bit more with his powers. Then just doesn't waste a whole lot of time with Peter Parker mourning Uncle Ben's death. It's really just kind of running through things pretty fast. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. It just means that at the moment, Peter Parker recognizes the value of the lesson that his Uncle Ben was teaching him, and the idea that Uncle Ben wouldn't want to see Peter Parker just sit in a dark room listening to Evanescence all day long because of the fact that he died. Instead, he would want him to go out and to be a hero, to go out and to achieve and to do great things with his life. And so that's what he does. Of course, he actually perfects the adhesive formula that his father put together and develop his webbing because of it. And so, with that, it really sets the stage for him to go on and achieve great things. Not only that, we basically have the Green Goblin attacking the school. Now, the cool thing about this is that with Norman Osborn, the way he's depicted as the Green Goblin is incredible. incredibly awesome. I don't know how his depiction as the Green Goblin in terms of how he looked was received by a lot of traditional Spider-Man fans, but I thought it looked awesome because I was afraid that what we were going to get is basically a repeat of the Green Goblin from the original Spider-Man comics, but I think that if you're going to kind of reboot, you're going to reinvigorate, I think you got to reinvigorate across the board. You can't really, reinvigorate halfway. Of course, I guess you got to keep Spider-Man, design the same for the most part, but when it came to the Green Goblin, I mean, he was just this giant hulking beast, and it worked out well. Now, with regards to what I was saying earlier about how this was really Bendis looking at the previous stories, the Green Goblin first appeared in the Amazing Spider-Man number 14, and it was something like 25 issues before Peter Parker and the Green Goblin learned each other's identities. So it was a long time before they learned who the other was. Now, at this moment, Peter Parker does not know who the Green Goblin is, but of course the Green Goblin knows who Peter Parker is, and of course the words are kind of slurred and muddled and so on and so forth, and the Green Goblin effectively just wants to kill him. Now, the fight is left very open-ended. I mean, there's not a whole lot is left to the imagination. I mean, we see them fighting and so on, but in terms of the ending and what happens, it's really just the cops being called in when, half the school implodes on itself, and then this fight between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, leads into the city of New York itself. But it ultimately culminates in this battle where the Green Goblin basically falls off a bridge, reminiscent of Gwen Stacy falling to her death. And that's really it. I mean, he just falls into the water, and we don't really find out what happens next. Instead, all we ever really had were just a series of Green Goblin just muttering the word Parker, and that was really it. But what we end up having is Peter Parker basically learning the identity of the Green Goblin by way of Harry Osborn himself when he says, "It's my father, that I saw him survive. He didn't die. He basically went crazy. He burned down the house. He killed my mom. He lost his mind. He's just out there in left field. Someone has to stop him. Somebody has to be able to bring him to an end." But at the moment right now, in the eyes of Peter Parker, no one knows where the Green Goblin is. No one knows where he's at. And so at this point, it's really just kind of setting the stage by Bendis and Mark Bagley saying, hey, here's Ultimate Spider-Man right now. Here was the first villain he fought in the form of Norman Osborn. Here are what his powers are. Here's his close-knit group of friends. Here's his most likely love interest, Mary Jane Watson. And we'll see the introduction of Gwen Stacy and so on and so forth. We'll see those characters kind of grow and expand as the series goes on. But again, for a 7-issue introductory story arc, with the first issue really being double-sized, to be honest, it worked out pretty well, and it played out pretty well. Like, Ultimate Spider-Man was extremely well received by fans, and it really helped to just kind of like jettison the Ultimate Universe into success from the word go. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about Ultimate Spider-Man, because I'm kind of curious, and I will catch you all later. Peace.